In moments of crisis, unity is often treated as an absolute good. Agreements are praised, compromises are celebrated, and resistance is labeled as obstruction. Yet history repeatedly shows that not all unity preserves truth. Some agreements silence essential differences, and some compromises carry consequences that unfold long after the moment has passed. The story you are about to hear unfolds in a time when the survival of an empire seemed to depend on concession. Political pressure, military weakness, and fear of collapse shaped decisions at the highest levels. In this environment, silence was safer than resistance, and agreement promised relief. One man chose otherwise. By the early 15th century, the Byzantine world stood in visible decline. Territories had been lost, resources exhausted, and the threat of Ottoman expansion loomed constantly. Constantinople remained standing, but its position was fragile. Survival no longer appeared guaranteed by strength, but by diplomacy. In this context, appeals for assistance turned increasingly toward the West. Military aid was sought, and with it came demands for theological agreement. The prospect of union between Eastern and Western Christianity was presented not as a matter of doctrine alone, but as a condition for political survival. For many, this union appeared pragmatic. Centuries of division were reframed as negotiable differences. The language of necessity replaced theological clarity. Under pressure, compromise promised immediate protection, even if long-term consequences remained uncertain. It was into this atmosphere that Mark, later known as Mark of Ephesus, emerged as a theological voice. Born in Constantinople, he was formed within the intellectual and spiritual tradition of Orthodoxy. His education combined rigorous theological training with deep immersion in the liturgical life of the Church. Mark's formation was not shaped by ambition. Historical accounts describe a man inclined toward study, prayer, and restraint rather than public authority. His commitment to doctrine developed slowly, grounded in fidelity to the teachings he had received rather than in opposition to others. As pressure for union intensified, bishops and theologians were drawn into negotiations that would culminate in the Council of Florence. Participation was framed as unavoidable. Silence, however, carried its own cost. To remain faithful would require clarity under circumstances designed to obscure it. Mark's intellectual formation unfolded within the final centuries of Byzantine theological life, a period marked by both refinement and tension. Study was not separated from worship. Theology was learned through Scripture, the writings of the Fathers, and constant participation in the liturgy. Doctrine was not abstract speculation, but the articulation of lived faith. From an early stage, Mark demonstrated a disciplined approach to learning. His engagement with theology emphasized continuity rather than innovation. He studied the councils, the patristic tradition, and the precise language used to safeguard doctrine. This attention to detail would later prove decisive when ambiguity became a political tool. Alongside academic formation, Mark embraced monastic discipline. Withdrawal from worldly ambition shaped his interior life, grounding study in ascetic restraint. Fasting, prayer, and silence were not secondary practices, but essential conditions for clarity. In monastic life, conviction was tested not by debate, but by endurance. This combination of study and asceticism produced a form of authority distinct from political or rhetorical power. Mark did not rely on charisma or persuasion. His strength lay in coherence. What he believed, he lived. What he lived, he articulated with precision. This alignment between life and teaching made compromise difficult. As theological discussions intensified, Mark's grounding became increasingly relevant. Terms once treated carefully were now softened for negotiation. Language was adjusted to accommodate agreement. For Mark, such adjustments carried weight. Precision was not rigidity, but fidelity to meanings preserved across centuries. His resistance was not emotional. He did not seek conflict, nor did he frame himself as a defender against enemies. Instead, he returned repeatedly to sources, texts, and definitions. In an environment favoring consensus, his insistence on clarity appeared disruptive. Yet for him, clarity was a form of responsibility. Monastic discipline reinforced this stance. Accustomed to obedience and restraint, Mark was not easily swayed by urgency or fear. Pressure that unsettled others encountered a stability formed through years of ascetic practice. Silence had taught him how to remain unmoved without becoming defiant. As preparations for the council advanced, Mark's role shifted from scholar to witness. He carried with him not a personal agenda, but a tradition he believed could not be reshaped by circumstance. The stage was set for confrontation, though he did not seek it. The Council of Florence unfolded under extraordinary strain. Delegations traveled far from their homelands, negotiations stretched over months, and the weight of expectation pressed heavily on every discussion. Political urgency shaped the atmosphere. Agreement was framed not as an option, but as a necessity tied to survival. Theological differences that had developed over centuries were brought to the table with the expectation of resolution. Language became a tool for negotiation. Terms were softened, explanations adjusted, and ambiguity tolerated in the hope that consensus might secure external aid. The cost of disagreement was presented as isolation. Within this environment, pressure mounted steadily. Bishops and theologians faced not only argument, but fatigue. Long sessions, unfamiliar surroundings, and constant reminders of political consequences wore down resistance. Agreement promised relief from tension and an end to prolonged uncertainty. Mark's position became increasingly isolated. He listened carefully, examined formulations, and returned to the inherited language of orthodoxy. Where others accepted compromise as temporary, he identified permanent implications. For him, definitions were not interchangeable. Each carried doctrinal boundaries shaped by the councils and the fathers. The pressure to sign was not merely procedural. It carried moral weight. To refuse was to risk being labeled an obstacle to unity and survival. Silence might preserve comfort, but agreement demanded explicit consent. Mark recognized that his decision would be public and irreversible. As negotiations progressed, a formula of union emerged. Many accepted it under the belief that differences had been sufficiently addressed. Mark, however, found the language inadequate. In his assessment, essential theological distinctions had been obscured rather than resolved. His refusal was not dramatic. He did not interrupt proceedings or issue public denunciations. He simply declined to sign. This quiet refusal stood in stark contrast to the collective momentum toward agreement. In a setting designed to absorb dissent, his stance remained singular. The significance of this act extended beyond the council hall. It revealed the limits of consensus when truth is treated as negotiable. Mark's refusal did not halt the council, but it introduced a fracture that could not be ignored. Agreement had been reached, yet unanimity had not. In the end, Mark stood alone among the Eastern bishops in refusing to endorse the union. His decision isolated him politically, but preserved theological continuity as he understood it. The council concluded, but the consequences of that refusal were only beginning to unfold. The conclusion of the council did not bring peace to Mark's life. While the agreement was celebrated by its supporters, its reception within the Eastern Church proved far more complex. Upon returning east, Resistance emerged among clergy and faithful who questioned the legitimacy of the union and the manner in which it had been achieved. Mark became a focal point of this resistance, not by organizing opposition, but by remaining consistent. His refusal to sign the decree had already marked his position. Now, his presence served as a reference for those who sensed that unity achieved through ambiguity could not sustain ecclesial life. Political and ecclesiastical pressure followed. Mark faced isolation, restrictions, and eventual exile. These measures were intended to neutralize his influence without turning him into a public martyr. Removed from centers of decision, he was expected to fade quietly from relevance. Exile, however, did not alter his stance. Cut off from formal authority, Mark continued to articulate his position through teaching and correspondence. His opposition was not framed as rebellion, but as fidelity. He did not claim victory, nor did he attempt to rally factions. His witness remained restrained and consistent. The simplicity of his resistance proved difficult to counter. There were no dramatic gestures to discredit, no political ambitions to expose. What remained was a theologian whose life aligned with his words, and whose words remained aligned with the inherited teaching of the Church. Over time, the union itself failed to take root in the East. Resistance persisted, and the agreement gradually lost authority. In this context, Mark's refusal gained retrospective clarity. What had appeared obstinate during the council now appeared prophetic in memory. Mark's health declined in his later years, weakened by hardship and confinement. Yet even as his strength faded, his position did not soften. He remained firm without bitterness, accepting suffering without framing it as validation. His witness did not rely on outcome, but on faithfulness. He fell asleep in the Lord in 1444. At the time of his death, he held no office and commanded no institution. Yet his influence had already extended beyond official structures. His fidelity became a measure by which the council itself would later be judged within the Orthodox memory. After Mark's repose, the significance of his witness continued to unfold within the life of the Orthodox Church. The union he had refused gradually lost credibility in the East. What had been signed under pressure failed to gain lasting reception among clergy and faithful. Over time, resistance proved stronger than political necessity. Within this process, Mark's role became clearer. He was remembered not as a polemicist, but as a measure of fidelity. His refusal did not fracture the Church. It revealed the limits of agreement when truth is treated as negotiable. Memory preserved his stance as an act of responsibility rather than defiance. The Orthodox Church did not immediately elevate Mark through institutional recognition. His legacy matured slowly, shaped by reflection rather than reaction. As generations revisited the council and its consequences, his position emerged as a point of clarity amid confusion. What he had preserved was not uniformity, but continuity. Mark came to be honored as a confessor of the faith, one who endured isolation and suffering without resorting to violence or rhetoric. His sanctity was not expressed through miracles or dramatic gestures, but through unwavering consistency. In an age of compromise, restraint itself became testimony. Within the Greek Orthodox tradition, his memory is preserved as a reminder that doctrinal precision is not rigidity, but care. The language of faith carries meaning shaped over centuries, and its preservation demands attentiveness, especially under pressure. Mark's life embodied this attentiveness without hostility. His witness also speaks beyond his historical moment. It raises enduring questions about unity, authority, and responsibility. When agreement is sought at any cost, discernment becomes essential. Mark's life demonstrates that silence may be safer, but clarity remains necessary. He did not live to see the full collapse of the political structures that shaped his choices, nor did he seek validation through outcomes. His faithfulness was complete in itself, measured not by success, but by alignment with what he had received and believed. Saint Mark of Ephesus stands in Orthodox memory as a figure of quiet resistance. His life affirms that endurance does not always appear victorious in its moment. Sometimes it waits. Preserved through memory and liturgy, his witness continues to shape how the Church understands fidelity under pressure. If this documentary helped you reflect on the cost of truth and the weight of discernment, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we continue to explore the lives of Orthodox saints and witnesses whose faith was shaped not by compromise, but by clarity, restraint, and perseverance across history.